For the past 2 years, I've been working as a mortician at a funeral home in a small town. I actually love it here. I listen to lots of audiobooks, my boss is great, and I don't mind the company of the dead. They're quiet and they're not trying to sell me something, which is a lot more than I can say for most of the living. I also feel like preparing the bodies for burial is an act of respect, a service to the community, something that gives my life meaning. Without a doubt, working here was the best job I'd ever had. Until we started getting the smiling corpses. I don't know when it started exactly. 3 weeks ago, I think, although time has been passing strangely since it all began. When it started, of course, not all the bodies were smiling. It was just one or two. Then we started getting more and more of them, and everything began to spiral out of control. To be clear, yes, I know that sometimes the deceased appear to be smiling slightly. Sometimes their facial features are built that way, sort of a resting happy face. Sometimes we even turn their lips up a little, to make their faces seem more familiar, more alive, instead of the cold mask of death. But these bodies weren't smiling slightly. No, they were full-on grins, stretching dead skin to the corners of their mouths. They were grotesque. The first one came on a cold, rainy day. Her name was Amber, and she was 31 years old. Much younger than the bodies I usually worked with. She died of a sudden blood clot. As much as I liked my job, I hated dealing with the younger ones. Before I even unzipped the body bag, I was imagining the small children she may have left behind, the aging parents grieving their daughter, the friends and family mourning a life gone too soon. I extinguished the thoughts and got to work. I turned on the light, rolled the steel bed a little closer to me, and reached for the body bag zipper. But when I unzipped her, I froze. She was smiling. Her lips were pressed tightly together, covering her teeth, and the corners of her mouth sharply curved upwards. An expression like that wouldn't just require you to move your facial muscles. It would require you to hold them like that. I quickly unzipped the rest of the bag, but she was definitely dead. Her skin was as white as marble. Her eyes were closed. Her lips were blue. What the fuck? Maybe she was somehow alive? Hands shaking, I gently touched her lips, then her cheeks. Her skin was so cold. I reached into the body bag and pulled out her bony wrist, checking for a pulse. There wasn't any. Now, if I weren't a mortician, I'd be thinking, no big deal. She died smiling, and rigor mortis set in, but I knew that was impossible. Rigor mortis takes hours. If she died smiling, her face would naturally relax into a neutral setting before everything went stiff. I stood there, my head spinning. There was no way she was alive, but there was no way she could be grinning like this, dead. Not knowing what else to do, I called my boss in. He looked just as confused as I was. Maybe she had some sort of deformity, he said, and this is her natural expression. I don't think so. The next theory was that the coroner was doing it before the bodies got to us. Maybe it was a prank, or maybe he thought he was helping us, making the bodies look a little less dead. He was a bit odd, so it wasn't out of the question. But even if he made them smile, the smile would fade before they got here, I pointed out. That kind of smile with her lips covering her teeth like that requires the muscles to stay flexed. Alan didn't know what to say to that, so he excused himself to call the coroner. When he came back, his expression was grim. Jack said she wasn't smiling when he was doing the autopsy. Dread flooded me, like someone had just dumped a bucket of ice water over me. So the smile had happened after she died? On the drive over from the coroner? That's impossible, I said, my voice wavering. I know. Who else had access to the bodies? He shook his head. No one should have had access to the body, except us, the coroner, and the drivers who delivered her. Well, fuck. We made a few more calls to police officers, medical examiners, even a few EMTs, but no one knew what we were talking about. And the body had been securely locked away after the autopsy, according to the coroner. It looked like no one had tampered with the body, so Maybe it was just something about Amber. Something congenital, some sort of disease or something. That her mouth turned up in a smile several hours after death. I knew it made no sense, but what else was I supposed to tell myself? That some demon had possessed her dead body and made it smile? That a ghost was holding up the corners of her mouth? Nothing made sense. What should I do with her? I asked Alan. Set her features like normal, I guess, he replied. Call me back if there's anything else weird. Then he turned on his heel and walked away. So that's what I did. After pacing the room a few times to calm myself down, I walked back over to the body. I positioned my index and middle fingers over the corners of her mouth, and in one swift motion, pushed down. Something felt different. I poked and prodded her cheeks, frowning. Usually cheeks are soft, with the cheekbones and jawbones giving them structure. But her cheeks felt firm all over, like they had their own internal structure somehow. Maybe she had work done, like fillers or Botox. I thought. I poked and prodded some more, but that only confused me further. Something just felt off about the way her bones and facial muscles were all fitting together, just underneath the skin. I called Alan back over. Does her face feel weird to you? He poked and prodded at her face as well, frowning. A little bit, he said finally, but not abnormally. Could be plastic surgery. That's what I thought. Hey, maybe that's why she's smiling. I mean, it's possible, I guess, he replied. Then he left, and I was back to setting her features all alone in the morgue. My fingers worked over her cold skin quickly, trying to get the whole thing over with as fast as possible. But the more I worked, the more time I spent with her alone in this room, the more panicked I became. Suddenly I felt dizzy. I couldn't breathe, couldn't get enough oxygen. My legs felt weak underneath me. I was on the verge of a panic attack. I stepped away from the body, forced myself to take a deep breath. Name 5 things you can see, I told myself. Cabinets, hand sanitizer, scissors, linens, and Amber's dead body. This grounding technique wasn't quite as effective when I was in the morgue room. I'd never had a panic attack here before. The bodies had never bothered me like this. I was always able to dissociate it from the person who lived in it. I was always able to convince myself it was just dead flesh, just something left behind, no different than the strands of hair and dead skin we leave behind when we're alive. But this time was different. The grotesque grin, pushing my fingers hard into her flesh, forcing her mouth to turn down. Something deep inside me snapped. I took a few more minutes to collect myself, taking in deep, calming breaths. Then I forced myself to continue working. I walked over to the cabinet, got out the clear thread, and started to sew her mouth shut. You had to, otherwise their mouth would loll open and look weird. I'd forgotten to do it once, and it was the only time Alan yelled at me. But as I worked on the stitches, I couldn't stop picturing Amber's grin. And I felt like there was more resistance from her lips than there should have been. Or was I imagining it? The needle slipped against my fingers, but I forced myself to keep going, even though my heartbeat was ratcheting up again. I ran a comb through her dyed blonde hair, arranging it with my hands. I swirled a brush in a pressed powder and swept across her cheeks, her forehead, her nose. I chose a nice, natural, peach-colored lipstick and applied it to her lips. Then I was done. I put the final touches on her face, poking and prodding here and there. And then it was over. I stepped back and gave her a final look. Honestly, I'd done a pretty great job. Her expression was perfectly peaceful. She almost looked like she was asleep. Then I left the room to grab the pair of earrings that the family left for her. As soon as I put them in, I'd be done, and I'd never have to look at this woman ever again. I grabbed them from the office, then hurried back to the morgue. I froze. Amber was smiling again. "Alan?" I shouted. "Alan?" The floor spun underneath me. I heard Alan's footsteps behind me, quickly approaching. I was losing my balance. I stumbled over to the wall and leaned against it, trying not to fall. "I set her features," I told him. "I stitched her mouth shut." "And she's grinning again." Alan stood there frozen, his mouth hanging open, his brown skin ashen. Without a word, he walked into the room, looking over her. For several seconds, he didn't say anything. "I've never seen anything like this," he said finally. I joined him at her side, looked down at her awful, smiling face. I noticed one of the stitches had snapped. A piece of clear thread trailed out of her mouth. It couldn't be Ben playing with us, could it? I asked. I wished it was. With all my being, I wished this was some ridiculous prank and not the body moving on its own. Ben was the other mortician. He was considerably younger than me and Alan, only 21, and heavily influenced by social media. He was always filming something or talking about some TikTok challenge he'd done. It was nauseating. I don't think so. He's supposed to be getting the other body ready. But we can check the security footage. Alan had installed security cameras in every room of the funeral home after someone had broken in over the summer. I followed him down the hallway, feeling a little better with each step I put between myself and Amber. He sat down at the desk and pulled up the security footage. I held my breath as he hit play. I watched the screen as I worked on Amber's body, in the grainy black and white footage. I watched as I left to get the earrings. The door swung shut. 1 second passed. 2. And then it happened. The corners of Amber's mouth yanked up, like they were attached to fishing line that had suddenly been pulled taut. What the hell? Alan said. That can't happen, can it? I asked, my voice shaking. No, there's no way that can happen. Dead bodies move after death on occasion. Twitching is common, caused by the release of chemicals left over in nerve endings. Decomposition can also make the body move. I'd read an article about a man whose arms had stretched straight out at his sides, weeks after death, because of decomposition. But this wasn't decomposition, because she'd been, presumably, stored properly since her death. And this wasn't a random twitch either. It was a grin. I'd read somewhere, in some inspirational article somewhere, that it took only 12 muscles to smile, and many more to frown. That meant all 12 of Amber's facial muscles were working in concert, making and wound the footage, playing the footage over and over again, muttering to himself about rigor mortis and other medical jargon. But I couldn't sit there and keep watching it. Each time I saw that grin yank up again, I felt like I might vomit. I left the office and hurried back to the morgue. I wanted Amber gone, and she would be tomorrow morning when we drove her to the cemetery. Whatever this all was, it would be gone and over with by 11 a.m. tomorrow. All I had to do was set her face again, load her into one of the refrigerated cabinets, and my job was done. When I opened the door, I found Ben standing over Amber's corpse. "Whoa," he said as I walked in. "What did you do to this one?" "Nothing. She came like that." "Seriously? What's wrong with her?" "Nothing to my knowledge. But she's smiling." "I know." He glanced back at me, obviously confused. "I don't know what's going on, okay?" And neither does Alan. "She looks like she's grinning, and when I set her face, she went back to grinning. Her face just does that, and we don't know why. She looks really creepy," he said with a grin. And then I saw his hand twitch towards his pocket, towards his phone. "Don't you even think about taking a picture," I snapped at him. I guess to Ben, the allure of making a viral TikTok video outweighed the chances of ruining his entire career. Ben left, looking dejected. Idiot. As soon as he was gone, I forced myself to re-sew her mouth shut. Then I pushed the corners of her mouth down, hard, until she looked like she was frowning. Maybe that was my problem, last time. Maybe I needed to set her features in the complete opposite direction. I'm sure the family would be pissed to see her frowning at the funeral, but I didn't care. Then I slid her into the cabinet. As soon as the door shut, relief flooded me. It's over. I'm done. Little did I know, Amber was just the